a packed Boston nightclub, a single spark in the decorations, and 492 people who could not find the doors. It is just past 10 o'clock on a Saturday night, the 28th of November, 1942, and the Cocoanut Grove is the loudest, brightest room in the city. The war is on, the boys are home for the weekend, and more than 1,000 people have crowded into a club that was never built to hold half that many. There are sailors in dress whites and soldiers on leave with their dates. There are couples out for a once-in-a-lifetime night. There is a famous cowboy movie star at a table near the floor show. The band is playing, the drinks are flowing, and the ceiling above them is hung with yards of blue satin meant to look like a soft summer sky. Down in the basement bar, a teenage busboy strikes a match to see what he is doing in the dark. Within 5 minutes, most of the people in this room will be dead or dying, and the doors they are running toward will not save them. This is the story of the deadliest nightclub fire in American history, and of how 492 deaths in 12 minutes forced this country to change the way it builds every public room you have ever walked into since. To understand how a night out turned into a tomb, you first have to understand the place itself, and the man who ran it. The Cocoanut Grove sat at number 17 Piedmont Street, in a low district of Boston called Bay Village, a short walk from the theaters and the better hotels. It had started years earlier as a prohibition speakeasy and grown into the most popular nightclub in the city. The name was a fantasy of someplace warmer, someplace tropical, and the decor leaned into it hard. There were artificial palm trees made of fabric and paper. There were rattan and bamboo coverings on the walls. There was that famous rolling blue satin ceiling, and in the main dining room a roof that could open to the stars on warm nights. People came to forget that there was a war on, to feel for a few hours like they were somewhere far away. On this particular Saturday, they came in numbers the building had never seen. The man who owned the Cocoanut Grove was a Boston lawyer named Barnett Wilansky, though almost everyone called him Barney. He was a hard, careful, secretive man who ran the club like a private fortune, which is what it was. He had connections that mattered in Boston. He knew people in city government, he knew people in the inspection offices, and he was friendly with the mayor of the day, Maurice Tobin. Those connections were the kind that kept a crowded nightclub open when a stricter reading of the rules might have closed it. Wilansky was not at the club the night it burned. He was in a hospital bed recovering from a heart attack. He would learn what had happened to his nightclub from the newspapers, the same as everyone else. Here is the thing about Barney Wilansky that everything turns on. He was terrified of people leaving without paying their tab. It was a small, ordinary kind of greed, the sort that runs a tight ship and watches every dollar. But in a building packed with 1,000 people, that small greed became something monstrous. To stop customers from slipping out the side doors without settling up, Wilansky had ordered exits locked. Some doors were bolted. Some were hidden behind drapes, so the customers would not even think to use them. One emergency exit had reportedly been bricked over. The doors that were meant to let people out in an emergency had been treated, instead, as holes in his cash register and sealed accordingly. On any ordinary night, nobody noticed. The customers came in the front, and they left through the front, through a single revolving door on Piedmont Street, and the locked side exits were simply invisible. The trap was set, and it had been sitting there quietly for a long time, waiting for a reason to spring. That Saturday gave it every reason. November the 28th, 1942, was the day of one of the most famous football games in the history of the sport. Across town at Fenway Park, the College of the Holy Cross was playing Boston College, and Boston College came into that game undefeated, ranked among the best teams in the country, with a trip to the Orange Bowl all but booked. They were heavy favorites, and then Holy Cross did the unthinkable and beat them 55-12 in front of more than 40,000 people. It is still remembered as one of the great upsets in college football. Boston College had reserved the Cocoanut Grove that night for a victory party. After a loss that ugly, they canceled. The Boston College players and their friends stayed away, and so they were not in the building when it caught fire. The cruelty of that night is layered thick. The men who were saved by a humiliation, and the men and women who died had simply come out to enjoy a Saturday. The room was overflowing. The Cocoanut Grove had a legal capacity that was somewhere around 600 people. Many accounts put the official figure even lower, closer to 460. On that night, the crowd has been estimated at more than 1,000. People were jammed shoulder to shoulder at the tables, lined 3 deep at the bars, packed into a basement lounge that was meant to be cozy and intimate. The club had recently opened a brand new lounge to handle the wartime crowds, and that edition was full too. Every chair was taken. Every aisle was crowded. The waiters could barely move between the tables. It was, by every account, one of the best nights of business the Cocoanut Grove had ever had, and the more people you pack into a room with the doors locked, the smaller the margin between a good night and a catastrophe becomes. On this night, that margin was gone. The fire began downstairs, in the Melody Lounge. This was the basement bar, a dim and romantic room with a low ceiling, a small revolving stage, and a piano. Artificial palm trees stood around the room. A young woman named Goody Goodell was playing piano on the little stage. The lights were kept low on purpose, soft and shadowy, the way a romantic basement bar likes to be. And it was that low light that lit the fuse, in a way nobody could have predicted. A young soldier and his date wanted a little more privacy than the room was giving them. So the soldier reached up and loosened a light bulb in one of the artificial palm trees to put their corner of the room into darkness. A bartender noticed the bulb had gone dark and did not like it. He told a 16-year-old busboy named Stanley Tomaszewski to go fix it. Tomaszewski went over to the palm tree in the corner, in the dark, and he could not see the socket. So he did what a person does when they need to see in the dark. He struck a match, he found the bulb, he screwed it back in, and by every account he then put the match out. It was a completely ordinary thing to do. People struck matches in that club all night long. But in the seconds after, the fronds of that artificial palm tree began to glow and then to burn. This is the moment the whole disaster hangs on, and it is also the moment that has never been settled. For decades, the story was simple. The busboy lit a match, the match lit the palm tree lit the world. But the official investigation could never actually prove that the match was the cause. The fire commissioner's report, in the end, listed the origin of the fire as unknown. The flames seemed to move faster and stranger than a burning paper palm tree should explain. Some investigators wondered whether faulty electrical wiring behind the decorations had played a part. Years later, a researcher named Charles Kenny advanced another theory, that a flammable gas may have been involved, perhaps methyl chloride, which was being used as a wartime substitute for the refrigerant Freon in the club's cooling system. If that gas had leaked, it could explain the unnatural speed of the fire. None of it was ever proven. What we can say honestly, more than 80 years later, is that we know where the fire started, and we do not know for certain what started it. The match is the famous answer. It may not be the true one. What is not in dispute is what happened next, and how fast. The bartenders saw the palm tree burning and grabbed for water and seltzer bottles. They tried to beat it out, but the fire was already climbing, racing up the fronds toward the low ceiling of the basement lounge, and the ceiling and the walls were covered in those same flammable materials. In a matter of seconds, the fire was not a burning decoration anymore. It was a fireball spreading across the ceiling of the Melody Lounge, and the room began to fill with thick, black, choking smoke. The people in the basement, sitting at their tables a moment ago, were now in a dark room that was burning over their heads. There was only one easy way out of that basement, and it was a single stairway leading up to the main floor. So the crowd in the Melody Lounge did the only thing they could. They ran for the stairs, and as they crowded up that narrow staircase, the fire came with them, drawn upward exactly the way fire is always drawn upward, following the rush of air and the press of bodies. The stairway acted like a chimney. The fireball that had started in a corner of the basement was funneled up the stairs and burst out into the foyer of the main floor, and then into the main dining room, where hundreds of people were sitting at dinner with no idea that anything was wrong. Think about what that was like for the people in the main room. One moment they are at their table, the band is playing, the floor show is about to start. The next moment, there is screaming from the direction of the basement stairs, and then a wall of fire and black smoke comes rolling across the ceiling of their own room, across that beautiful blue satin sky, and it is on top of them before they can stand up. Witnesses described a sheet of flame that crossed the entire dining room in seconds. The lights went out. The room filled with a smoke so thick and so poisonous that people fell where they stood. Some of the dead were later found still sitting in their chairs, at their tables, as if the fire had reached them before they ever understood they were in danger. The whole thing, from the first glow on the palm tree to a building completely engulfed, took somewhere around 5 minutes. Some accounts say the fire raced through the entire club in less than that. The National Archives, drawing on the official records, put the time at roughly 8 minutes from start to full involvement. Either way, you are talking about a span shorter than it takes to tell the story. There was no time. That is the heart of it. There was simply no time for 1,000 people to get out of a building that small, even if every door had been wide open. And the doors were not open. Now we come to the part that turned a terrible fire into the deadliest nightclub fire in the history of the world. The main entrance to the Cocoanut Grove was a revolving door. A single revolving door, the kind that turns on a central post with 4 glass leaves, letting 1 or 2 people through at a time. On an ordinary night it worked fine, but hundreds of panicked people do not move 1 or 2 at a time. They surge, they push from behind, and when that crowd hit the revolving door all at once, all trying to force their way out, the door jammed. Bodies piled against both sides of it. The door, overwhelmed, stopped turning entirely and then broke. The single best exit from the building became a solid wall of glass and trapped human beings. People died standing up, pressed against that door, unable to move forward and unable to go back. The other doors should have saved them. They did not, because of Barney Wilansky's fear of unpaid tabs. The side exits had been bolted, or hidden, or in at least one case bricked over. A panic bar on one door, the kind that is supposed to let a crowd shove a door open from the inside, had reportedly been disabled by a bolt holding the door shut. And the doors that did open, opened the wrong way. They swung inward, into the building, against the direction people were running. When a crowd presses against a door that opens inward, the crush of bodies holds it shut. The harder they push to get out, the more impossible it becomes to open. So the people piled up against those inward swinging doors and held them closed with their own desperate weight, and they died there in heaps, only inches from the cold November air on the other side. Fire investigators said afterward, in plain and devastating language, that if the doors had simply swung outward, hundreds of lives might have been saved. One estimate put it at 300 people alive for the want of a door that opened the right way. That is not a mechanical detail. That is the difference between a fire and a massacre. There was one piece of brutal luck in the timing. A fire crew was already nearby. Just before the Cocoanut Grove fire, firefighters had been called to put out a small car fire on Stewart Street, around the corner. They were finishing up when they saw smoke pouring from the nightclub. The alarm, recorded as Box 1521, came in at about 20 minutes past 10. Engine companies were on the scene within minutes, far faster than would normally have been possible, and it did not matter. By the time the first hoses were playing on the building, the fire inside was already nearly over, because there was almost nothing left to burn and almost no one left to save. The firefighters arrived to find the dead stacked against the doors. They had to pull bodies away from the exits just to get inside. Hardened men who had seen everything wept on that sidewalk. Some of them carried the memory of what they found in that building for the rest of their lives. When the smoke cleared and the count was finally made, the number was almost too large to take in. 492 people were dead. Hundreds more were injured, many of them gravely burned, many of them with their lungs scorched by the searing, toxic smoke. The dead were ordinary people who had come out for a Saturday night. Servicemen on leave, newlyweds, a group from out of town, the famous cowboy actor Buck Jones, a star of dozens of Western films, was at the club that night, and he died of his burns 2 days later. The toll passed every comparison anyone could reach for. It remains the deadliest nightclub fire ever recorded anywhere in the world, and one of the worst single-building fires in the history of the United States. The disaster did not end when the fire went out. It moved, in the space of an hour, to the hospitals of Boston, and that is where this story takes a turn that almost no one expects, because out of one of the worst nights in American history came some of the most important advances in the history of medicine. The injured came in waves. Boston City Hospital and Massachusetts General Hospital took the bulk of them. At Massachusetts General, the victims arrived so fast that, by one account, a new patient came through the doors on average every 11 seconds. The hospitals were overwhelmed in a way that no peacetime hospital had ever been overwhelmed. And the doctors faced injuries they did not fully understand. These were not just surface burns. Many of the victims had inhaled superheated poisonous smoke, and their airways and lungs were burning from the inside. Others were dying of something the doctors of that era struggled to explain, a kind of collapse that set in hours after the burns, where the body seemed to bleed its fluids out into the damaged tissue until the circulation failed. Today we call it burn shock. In 1942, it was killing people who had survived the fire itself. A surgeon at Massachusetts General named Dr. Oliver Cope had been studying burns and, almost by chance, was ready for this. Cope and his colleagues understood that the old approach to burns, scrubbing them raw and coating them in tannic acid and dyes, was doing more harm than good. Instead, they treated the burns gently, covering them with sterile petroleum jelly dressings and leaving them alone to heal. More important still, they understood that the great early killer was the loss of fluid. So they pushed fluids into their patients aggressively, plasma and saline, in large measured amounts calculated against the size of the burn, to keep the circulation from collapsing. The careful records they kept on the Cocoanut Grove victims, on how much fluid a burned body needs in those first crucial hours, became the foundation of a formula that doctors would use to treat burn patients for decades afterward. People who would have died of burn shock lived. The difference between the two Boston hospitals was stark. At Massachusetts General, under the new gentle, fluid-focused approach, the burn results were dramatically better than the older methods being used elsewhere. Then there was the second breakthrough, and it is one of the most remarkable footnotes in the entire history of medicine. In 1942, penicillin was not something you could buy. It was the most promising drug in the world, and almost none of it existed. It was being made in tiny experimental batches, and nearly all of what existed was reserved for the military, because there was a war on, and infection was killing wounded soldiers. There was barely any available for civilians at all, but the Cocoanut Grove victims, with their massive burns, were desperately vulnerable to infection, and infection in a burn ward was its own kind of slow death sentence. So the government released the drug. The pharmaceutical company Merck in New Jersey packed up a supply of penicillin, reported at around 32 liters of the culture liquid in which the mold was grown, and sent it racing north to Boston under police escort. Cars carrying one of the rarest substances on Earth ran through the night to reach the burned survivors of a nightclub fire. At Massachusetts General, in the first days of December 1942, doctors used that penicillin on the Cocoanut Grove patients to fight off the infections that came with their burns and their skin grafts. It is widely described as one of the first times penicillin was used on a large scale on civilian patients in the United States. The wonder drug of the 20th century, the drug that would go on to save uncountable millions of lives, got one of its first public proving grounds in the wards full of people who had been pulled out of the Cocoanut Grove. Something true and good came out of that fire, even as the city was still burying its dead. The dead, meanwhile, demanded an accounting, and the city of Boston went looking for someone to blame. The investigations came one after another. There was a grand jury. There were hearings. There was the fire commissioner's report. And the public anger, vast and bottomless, settled on the owner. And Barney Wilansky, still recovering from his heart attack, found himself charged with manslaughter. The case was not built on the cause of the fire, because the cause could not be proven. It was built on the death trap, the locked exits, the hidden doors, the flammable decorations, the overcrowding. The choices a man had made, for money, that turned a building full of people into a building full of victims. In April of 1943, Barnett Wilansky was convicted on 19 counts of manslaughter. 19, because the prosecutors had selected 19 of the dead, almost at random, to stand in legally for all 492. He was sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. From his hospital bed, before the trial, Wilansky was reported to have said that he wished he had died in the fire with the others. Whether that was guilt or self-pity, no one can say. What happened next says a great deal about how Boston worked in those years. Wilansky served less than 4 years. In 1946, he was quietly pardoned by the governor of Massachusetts, who happened to be Maurice Tobin, the very man who had been mayor and Wilansky's friend in the days when the Cocoanut Grove operated freely. Wilansky walked out of prison a sick and broken man, and he died of cancer just a few weeks later. He reportedly said, on his release, that he wished he had died in the fire. He had said it before. This time, it came true soon enough. And the busboy, Stanley Tomaszewski, 16 years old, who had struck the match. He testified at the inquiry, and the investigators cleared him. He had not hung the flammable decorations. He had not locked the doors. He had not packed 1,000 people into a room built for 600. He had struck a match to see a light socket in the dark, which any of us might have done, and the official finding was that the cause of the fire was unknown. But the public needed a face, and his was the one in the newspapers. Stanley Tomaszewski carried that fire for the rest of his life. He received hate mail. People blamed him to his face. He lived a quiet life and tried to do good, but he was never fully free of the night he struck that match. He died in 1994, more than 50 years later, still tied to a fire that the law itself had never proven he caused. He is one more victim of the Cocoanut Grove, in his own way, even though he walked out of the building alive. So what did all of those deaths buy? This is where the story turns from tragedy to consequence, because the Cocoanut Grove fire did not just horrify the country, it changed it, permanently, in ways that protect you right now without your ever thinking about it. In the months and years after the fire, Massachusetts and then states across the nation rewrote their rules for public buildings. The National Fire Protection Association, which wrote the standards that cities adopted, took the lessons of the Cocoanut Grove and built them into what became the Life Safety Code, the document that still governs how public buildings handle a crowd in an emergency. Almost every change can be traced straight back to a body found behind a door in Boston. Exit doors in public buildings were required to swing outward in the direction people flee, so that a panicked crowd pushing to get out would force the door open instead of holding it shut. Revolving doors could no longer stand alone as a main exit. Where they were used, they had to be flanked by ordinary hinged doors, or built so their leaves would fold flat under pressure, so that a jammed revolving door could never again become a wall. Exits had to be unlocked, unobstructed, and clearly marked. Illuminated exit signs became mandatory. Signs that glow so you can find your way through a dark and smoke-filled room toward the way out. Emergency lighting with its own power supply was required, so that when the main lights fail, as they failed in Boston, there is still enough light to see by. Flammable decorations like the ones that turned the Cocoanut Grove into a fireball were banned from public assembly spaces. Buildings that hold crowds were required to have enough exits, of enough width, to actually empty the room. And the use of automatic sprinklers, which could have drowned the fire in the basement before it ever reached the stairs, was pushed forward hard. You have walked through these rules 1,000 times without seeing them. The next time you are in a crowded theater, or a restaurant, or a hotel ballroom, look around for a moment. That glowing red exit sign over the door. The door itself, with its push bar, swinging outward when you lean on it. The little secondary lights tucked up near the ceiling. The pair of normal doors sitting right beside the revolving one at the front of the building. Every one of those things is there because of a single Saturday night in 1942. They are written in a code that was paid for in advance by 492 people who went out dancing and could not find a way back to the street. That is the strange and lasting weight of the Cocoanut Grove. It was a fire that should not have killed so many, in a building that should never have been allowed to fill up the way it did, started by a cause we will probably never be sure of, ended by doors that opened the wrong way for the sake of a few unpaid tabs. It killed a movie star and a soldier home on leave, and a young couple at a corner table, all in less time than it takes to finish a song. And then, almost as if to make some kind of cruel sense of it, it pushed medicine forward and rewrote the rules of every public room in America, so that the next 1,000 people, and the 1,000 after that, would have a fighting chance the Cocoanut Grove never gave anyone. They could not find the doors, so the country changed the doors. And it changed them for you, whether you ever knew their names or not. If you want more forgotten stories like this one, the ones that quietly shape the world you live in, subscribe and stay with us.